She couldn't speak. The words he just said didn't make sense. Couldn't be real. Her husband stood in the hospital room 3 hours after she'd nearly died giving birth to his twins, and told her he'd married someone else. Pack your things. Leave now. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled. The emergency surgery had left her body shattered, bleeding, barely functional. Her newborn daughters screamed in her arms, sensing the cold, sensing the danger, sensing that everything was wrong. He didn't care. He walked out, left her there, threw them into a blizzard with nowhere to go. She thought her life was over. She thought she'd lost everything. She had no idea that her mother had left her $1 billion fortune. She had no idea that every move he made was being watched, recorded, documented. She had no idea that 30 days later, she'd become the most powerful woman he'd ever faced. This is the story of a woman who was left to die in the snow, and how she became a queen. What happened next changed everything. Welcome back to the channel. And if this is your first time here, welcome. We share real stories about betrayal, survival, and justice. Stories that need to be heard. Before we begin, do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the channel. It's free, it takes 1 second, and it means everything. And drop a comment telling us what time it is where you're watching from. Just the time and your location. It helps us understand our amazing community. Whether it's 3 a.m. in Australia or noon in Texas, we want to hear from you. Now let's dive into what happened. The wind howled through the streets of New York like a wounded animal, tearing at anything foolish enough to be caught outside. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, burying the city in a silence broken only by the occasional wail of distant sirens. Inside St. Catherine's Hospital, room 304 was warm, sterile, and about to become the scene of the cruelest betrayal Lila Montgomery would ever experience. She lay in the hospital bed, her body still trembling from the emergency C-section that had nearly killed her 3 hours earlier. The twins, her beautiful, perfect twins, lay wrapped in thin blankets in her arms, their tiny fingers curled against her chest. She had counted their fingers, their toes, whispered promises into their soft hair. She had told them they were safe now, that everything would be okay, that their father would come soon and hold them and love them the way she did. She had believed it. God help her. She had believed every word. The door opened. Blake Carrington walked in, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's rent, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his hair perfectly styled despite the blizzard outside. He looked like a man who had somewhere important to be, someone important to see. He looked at Lila the way you'd look at a stain on your shirt, something irritating that needed to be dealt with quickly. His eyes never once dropped to the twins. Not once. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat and businesslike, as if he were ending a meeting rather than a marriage. Lila's heart began to pound. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her abdomen like lightning, forcing her back against the pillows. "Blake, what's going on? Why didn't you come earlier? I tried calling you, but—" "I've been busy," he interrupted, checking his watch. Behind him, the door opened again, and Valeria Danton stepped inside. Valeria, with her designer coat and her red lipstick, and her smile that looked like it had been painted on with a knife. Valeria, who had been Lila's friend, her confidant, the woman who had held her hand through morning sickness and reassured her during every moment of panic. Valeria, who now stood beside Blake like she belonged there, like she had every right to be in this room at this moment. Lila's stomach twisted. "Val, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Paris for—" Blake cut her off again, his tone sharper now, impatient. "Valeria's here because she's my wife now. We got married this morning." The words didn't make sense. They were sounds, syllables, and noise. Lila stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh and tell her it was some sick joke, some cruel prank. But he didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. Valeria stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tile floor, each step deliberate and slow, savoring the moment. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Lila. But honestly, did you really think Blake would stay with you? Look at yourself. Look at where you came from." Her voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it infinitely worse. You were a project. A charity case. And now the project's over. Lila couldn't breathe. The room tilted, the walls closing in, the fluorescent lights buzzing too loud in her ears. The twins stirred in her arms, sensing her distress, their tiny faces scrunching up as they began to cry. Blake glanced at them for the first time, his expression somewhere between annoyance and disgust. You need to leave, he said. Pack your things. I'll give you 10 minutes. Lila's voice came out in a broken whisper. Blake, I just had surgery. I can't even walk. Please, just let me stay until tomorrow. Please. He looked at his watch again. You have 10 minutes. Security will remove you if necessary. Valeria tilted her head, studying Lila like she was something fascinating under a microscope. You should have seen this coming. All those nights he came home late? All those business trips? He was with me, Lila. He's been with me for over a year. And honestly, she leaned in closer, her perfume choking the air. He's so much happier now. Lila wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something, to claw at Valeria's smug face, to demand answers, explanations, anything that would make this nightmare make sense. But her body wouldn't move. Her voice wouldn't work. She could only sit there, bleeding and broken, while the two people who had destroyed her stood over her like executioners waiting for the final blow. Blake turned toward the door. 10 minutes, he repeated, and then he was gone, Valeria following close behind, her laughter echoing down the hallway like nails on glass. The door closed. The silence was deafening. The twins cried louder now, their wails piercing and desperate, as if they knew their world had just collapsed. Lila looked down at them, at their red faces and their tiny fists, and something inside her cracked wide open. She had nothing. No home. No money. No family. Her mother had died 2 years ago, leaving her alone in a city that chewed people up and spit them out without a second thought. Blake had been her only anchor, the only person who had made her believe she was worth something. And now he had ripped that away, replaced her with someone who had pretended to be her friend, and thrown her out into a blizzard with 2 newborns who hadn't even been alive for 4 hours. How do you survive a moment like this? How do you take the next breath when everything you believed in has been torn apart? Lila didn't know, but the twins were crying, and she couldn't let them freeze. She couldn't let them die because of her weakness, her stupidity, her blind, idiotic trust. She forced herself to move. Every inch was agony. The stitches in her abdomen pulled and burned, threatening to tear open with every motion. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold tile floor, and the world spun violently. She gripped the bed rail, gasping, sweat dripping down her face despite the chill in the air. She couldn't do this. She couldn't. But she had to. She gathered the twins, wrapping them in the thin hospital blankets, tucking them against her chest as tightly as she could. She found her jacket, the one Blake had bought her last Christmas, back when he still pretended to care. It was too thin for winter, too flimsy to protect her from a storm outside, but it was all she had. She pulled it on, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the zipper. She grabbed the diaper bag, half empty and pathetic, and slung it over her shoulder. She took one last look at the hospital room, at the bed where she had given birth, at the monitors still beeping softly in the corner, and then she walked out. The hallway was bright and sterile, nurses moving efficiently from room to room, visitors chatting quietly. Everything normal, everything fine. No one looked at her. No one cared. She was invisible, just another woman leaving the hospital with her babies. Nothing worth noticing. She reached the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The twins whimpered against her chest, their little bodies shivering. "I'm sorry," she whispered to them, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed. The elevator descended, carrying her down, down, down into the storm. The lobby was nearly empty, just a security guard half asleep at the desk and a janitor mopping the floor. Lila walked past them through the automatic doors and into the blizzard. The wind hit her like a freight train. Snow blasted her face, blinding her, stealing her breath. The twins screamed, their cries lost in the roar of the storm. Lila stumbled forward, her feet slipping on ice, her body threatening to collapse with every step. She didn't know where she was going. She had no plan, no destination, no hope. She just walked because stopping meant dying, and she couldn't let her babies die. Her vision blurred. Her legs buckled. She fell against a brick wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the frozen pavement, the snow piling up around her. The twins were still crying, their voices growing weaker, and Lila knew she was losing consciousness. She knew she was dying. And in that moment, as the cold wrapped around her like a shroud, she thought maybe it would be better this way. Maybe it would be easier. But then a voice cut through the storm, low and steady and impossibly calm. Lila Montgomery? She looked up. A man stood over her, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in shadow. She didn't recognize him. She didn't care. "Your mother sent me," he said, crouching down beside her. "I'm going to get you out of here." And as Victor Hale lifted her into his arms, as the warmth of his car enveloped her and the twins finally stopped crying, Lila felt something she hadn't felt in hours. She felt the faintest flicker of hope. She didn't know it yet, but Blake Carrington had just made the worst mistake of his life. And the woman he had thrown away like garbage was about to become a queen. 6 months earlier, Lila's life had been small but purposeful. She taught at Lincoln Elementary, a crumbling school in a neighborhood most people avoided after dark. The building smelled like old chalk and broken dreams, the windows cracked, the heating system a joke during winter. But Lila loved it. She loved the kids who showed up hungry, who wore the same clothes 3 days in a row, who looked at her like she was the only adult in the world who gave a damn. She stayed up late every night, helping with homework, talking to parents who worked 3 jobs, and buying supplies with money she didn't have. Her apartment was a studio in a building with bars on the windows, but it was hers, paid for with a salary that barely covered rent and groceries. She didn't complain. She had learned early that complaining changed nothing. Her mother had taught her that before cancer took her 2 years ago, leaving Lila completely alone in a city that swallowed people whole. She had no siblings, no extended family, no safety net. Just her students, her tiny apartment, and a routine that kept her moving forward, because stopping meant thinking about how lonely she really was. That was when Blake Carrington walked into her life. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of rain that soaked through jackets and turned streets into rivers. Lila had stayed late again, organizing supplies in the empty classroom, when a stray cat wandered through the open door, soaking wet and shivering. She scooped it up without thinking, wrapping it in her scarf, whispering reassurances as it trembled against her chest. "You're okay now," she murmured, stroking its matted fur. "I've got you." That's when she heard the voice. "You always rescue strays?" Lila turned, startled. A man stood in the doorway, tall and sharp in an expensive coat, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain. He smiled at her, not the polite smile strangers give each other, but something warmer, something that made her feel like he'd been watching her for longer than she realized. "I teach here," she said, clutching the cat tighter, suddenly self-conscious about her old sweater and the chalk dust on her jeans. "And you are?" He stepped inside, his shoes clicking softly against the worn linoleum. "Blake Carrington. I'm consulting with the school board about funding. I was touring the building and saw the light on." He glanced at the cat, then back at her. "That's very kind of you. Most people wouldn't bother." Lila shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It's just a cat. It needed help." Blake's smile widened. "That says more about you than you think." He started showing up after that. Not every day, but often enough that Lila began to expect him. He'd bring coffee, the expensive kind from the cafe 3 blocks over, and sit in the back of her classroom while she taught, watching her with an intensity that should have felt creepy, but somehow didn't. He remembered everything she said. The scar on her wrist from when she'd fallen off her bike as a kid. Her favorite song, an old jazz tune her mother used to hum. The way she always checked on the quietest students first, because she knew they were the ones most likely to be struggling in silence. "How do you remember all that?" she asked one evening as they walked to the subway together. The city lights reflecting off wet pavement. Blake stopped, turning to face her, his expression serious. Because you're worth remembering, Lila. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever looked at her like she mattered beyond what she could give them. It felt like standing in sunlight after years in shadow. He courted her with a patience that felt almost old-fashioned. Flowers appeared on her desk. Notes tucked into her bag. Small gifts that showed he'd been paying attention. A book by her favorite author. A scarf in the exact shade of blue she'd mentioned liking. He never rushed her, never pressured her, just kept showing up, kept proving he was serious. "Why me?" she asked him one night over dinner at a restaurant far nicer than anywhere she'd ever been. "You could have anyone. Why does someone like me?" Blake reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Because you're real, Lila. Everyone else I've met is playing a role, trying to impress me, trying to get something from me. But you're just yourself. You care about things that actually matter. You make me want to be better." How do you resist words like that? How do you not fall when someone makes you feel like you've been invisible your whole life, and they're the first person to truly see you? 3 months later, he proposed. They were on the rooftop of the Mandarin Oriental. The city spread out beneath them like a constellation of electric stars. Blake had arranged everything, candles and roses and soft music playing from hidden speakers. When he dropped to one knee, holding out a ring that probably cost more than she'd make in 5 years, Lila's hands flew to her mouth. "Marry me," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Let me spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." She said yes. God help her. She said yes without hesitation, without doubt, without hearing the warning bells that should have been ringing in her head. The wedding was small, just a courthouse ceremony, because Blake said he didn't want to wait, and didn't want anything to delay the moment she became his wife. Lila didn't question it. She was too happy, too overwhelmed by the sudden change in her life. She had gone from lonely teacher to beloved wife in less than 6 months, and it felt like a fairy tale, the kind she'd stopped believing in years ago. Their early marriage was everything she dreamed of. Blake cooked for her elaborate meals that filled their apartment with warmth and laughter. He surprised her at work with lunch, kissing her in front of her students, making them giggle and whisper. He held her at night, his arms wrapped around her like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. They talked for hours about their future, about the children they'd have, the places they'd travel, the life they'd build together. "I never thought I could be this happy," Lila told him one night, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Blake kissed the top of her head. "You deserve this. You deserve everything." She believed him. She believed every word. But small things began to change, so gradually she almost didn't notice. Blake started coming home later, his explanations vague and hurried. "Work stress," he said. "Big project," he said. She believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. His phone started going to another room when it rang. "Client confidentiality," he explained with an easy smile. "You understand." She nodded, pushing down the unease twisting in her stomach. His patience began to fray. The man who had once listened to her talk about her students for hours now cut her off mid-sentence, distracted, distant. "Can we talk about this later?" he'd say, already turning away. "I'm exhausted." Lila told herself it was temporary. Every marriage went through rough patches. He was working hard to provide for them. She needed to be supportive, understanding, and patient. She cooked his favorite meals, kept the apartment spotless, and gave him space when he seemed irritable. She was trying so hard to be the perfect wife, to prove she deserved the life he'd given her. Then Valeria entered the picture. Blake introduced her as a business associate, someone he worked with on a major project. She was stunning, the kind of woman who turned heads without trying, elegant and polished in ways Lila could never be. "Lila, this is Valeria Danton," Blake said at a company dinner Lila had been reluctant to attend. "Val, this is my wife." Valeria's smile was warm, her handshake firm. "I've heard so much about you. Blake talks about you constantly." She seemed genuine, kind even. Over the following weeks, Valeria became a fixture in their lives. She'd stop by the apartment to drop off documents for Blake. She'd join them for dinner occasionally. Always charming, always interested in Lila's work, asking thoughtful questions about her students. Lila started to think of her as a friend, someone rare in a city where real connection was hard to find. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments that Lila caught and then immediately dismissed. The way Blake's voice softened when he talked to Valeria. The way they'd exchange glances across the table. Private jokes Lila wasn't part of. The way Valeria's hand would linger on Blake's arm just a second too long. You're imagining things, Lila told herself. You're being paranoid. She pushed the doubts away, buried them deep where they couldn't poison the happiness she'd fought so hard to believe in. But late at night, when Blake was asleep beside her, Lila would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling something dark and inevitable moving toward her. Something she couldn't name yet, but could feel in her bones. Have you ever known something was wrong, but convinced yourself you were crazy for thinking it? That's where Lila lived now, in the space between knowing and denial, trying desperately to hold onto a love that was already slipping through her fingers like water. And somewhere in the shadows, Blake and Valeria smiled, their plan unfolding exactly as they designed it, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy her completely. The betrayal didn't announce itself with fanfare or drama. It crept in quietly, through small invasions Lila didn't recognize until they'd already carved holes in her life. It started with the bank account. 3 months into their marriage, Blake suggested combining their finances. "We're a team now," he said one evening, pulling her close on the couch, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her shoulder. "What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine. That's how marriage works, right?" Lila hesitated. She didn't have much, just the modest savings she'd scraped together over years of careful spending, emergency money her mother had always insisted she keep. But Blake's logic made sense. They were married. They were building a life together. Keeping separate accounts felt like she didn't trust him. "Okay," she said finally, pushing aside the small voice in her head that whispered caution. "Let's do it." Blake kissed her forehead. "You won't regret this. I promise." Within weeks, money started disappearing. Small amounts at first, 50 here, 100 there, transactions Lila didn't recognize when she checked the statements. "Investment opportunities," Blake explained when she asked, barely glancing up from his phone. "I'm moving some funds around. Don't worry about it." She wanted to press further, but he looked tired, stressed, the weight of his job visible in the tension around his eyes. So she nodded and let it go, telling herself he knew what he was doing, that she was being paranoid for questioning him. By the second month, larger sums vanished. Lila's emergency fund, the money her mother had left her, began draining at an alarming rate. She confronted Blake one night after dinner, her stomach twisted in knots. "Blake, there's almost nothing left in the savings account. Where did it all go?" He set down his wine glass, his expression shifting from relaxed to irritated in seconds. "Are you seriously questioning how I manage our money? I'm working myself to death to provide for us, and you're interrogating me like I'm some criminal." The anger in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't the gentle man who had courted her so patiently. This was someone else, someone sharp and defensive. "I'm not interrogating you," Lila said quickly, hating how small her voice sounded. "I just want to understand what you need to understand," Blake interrupted, standing up and walking toward the window, his back to her, "is that I'm handling things. You teach kids for barely any money. I'm the one keeping us afloat. So maybe you should trust me instead of acting like I'm stealing from you." The accusation stung. Lila felt tears prick her eyes, shame flooding through her. He was right. She didn't contribute much financially. Who was she to question him? "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean it like that." Blake turned, his expression softening immediately, the anger evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have snapped at you. Work has been brutal, and I took it out on you. Forgive me." She nodded against his chest, relief washing over her. It was just stress, just pressure from work. Everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. The financial manipulation was only the beginning. Blake had been studying Lila long before he ever approached her in that classroom. He knew her history, knew she'd grown up poor, knew her mother had died, leaving her alone and vulnerable. He knew exactly what kind of woman she was, trusting and kind and desperate to believe someone could love her. Valeria had helped him research every detail, combing through social media, talking to people who knew Lila, building a profile of her weaknesses. She's perfect, Valeria had said months before Blake ever introduced himself. They were in his penthouse, planning, strategizing. Isolated, no family, low self-esteem. She'll never see it coming. Blake swirled the whiskey in his glass, studying the amber liquid. And you're sure about the inheritance? Valeria nodded, pulling up documents on her laptop. Her mother's estate was sealed, but I found the lawyer who handled it. There's money, Blake. A lot of it. But it's locked behind conditions. Lila won't have access until certain requirements are met. Blake leaned forward, interested now. What kind of requirements? Valeria smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who enjoyed other people's pain. Birth of a child. The entire fortune unlocks the moment she becomes a mother. Her mother set it up that way to protect her, make sure she was stable and settled before accessing that kind of wealth. Blake's mind was already racing. So we wait. I marry her, get her pregnant, and the moment those kids are born, the money becomes accessible. Exactly, Valeria said. And then we take it. All of it. She'll be too broken to fight back, and by the time she realizes what happened, we'll be untouchable. Blake raised his glass. To the perfect con. Valeria clinked her glass against his. To the perfect con. Back in the present, Lila remained oblivious to the conspiracy tightening around her. Valeria continued to play her role flawlessly, showing up at their apartment with gifts, acting concerned when Lila mentioned Blake's long hours, offering friendship when Lila felt increasingly isolated. How are you holding up? Valeria asked one afternoon, sitting across from Lila in a coffee shop near the school. Lila had been grateful for the invitation, desperate for connection with someone other than her students. I'm okay, Lila lied, stirring her tea absently. Blake's just been really busy lately. Valeria reached across the table, squeezing Lila's hand. Marriage is hard, especially in the beginning. But you two are solid. Anyone can see how much he loves you. The words should have been comforting, but something about the way Valeria said them fell off, like she was reading from a script. Lila pushed the feeling away. She was being paranoid again, seeing problems where none existed. Thanks, Val. That means a lot. Valeria smiled, and Lila missed the coldness behind it, the calculation in her eyes. How do you spot betrayal when it's dressed up as friendship? How do you protect yourself when the enemy has already infiltrated your life and you invited them in yourself? The nights grew colder as winter approached. Blake's absences became longer, his explanations thinner. He'd come home late smelling like perfume that wasn't Lila's. His clothes rumpled in ways that suggested more than just a long day at the office. When she asked where he'd been, he'd snap at her, tell her she was being clingy, suffocating, paranoid. I can't breathe in this marriage, he said one night, his voice cruel. You're always questioning me, always doubting me. Maybe if you trusted me, we wouldn't have these problems. Lila apologized. She always apologized. She tried harder, gave him more space, convinced herself that she was the problem, that if she could just be better, less needy, more understanding, things would go back to the way they were. But they never did. One evening, Lila found a receipt in Blake's jacket pocket while doing laundry. Dinner for two at an expensive restaurant downtown, the same night he'd told her he was working late. Her hands shook as she stared at the numbers. There's an explanation, she told herself, her voice barely audible in the empty apartment. There has to be an explanation. When Blake came home, she showed him the receipt, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. What's this? He glanced at it, completely unbothered. Business dinner. Client meeting. But it's only for two people, Lila said, hating how desperate she sounded. And you said you were at the office. Blake's expression hardened. Are you calling me a liar? No, because if you don't trust me, Lila, maybe we need to reconsider this marriage. Maybe you're not ready for the kind of partnership I need." Panic seized her. "No, Blake, please. I trust you. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought it up." He stared at her for a long moment, then sighed, pulling her into his arms. "I know you're scared. I know your abandonment issues make you worry. But I'm not going anywhere. You have to stop letting your past control you." Lila nodded against his chest, relief flooding through her even as shame burned in her gut. He was right. She was damaged, broken, letting her fears poison something beautiful. She needed to fix herself, not blame him. What Lila didn't know was that the receipt was intentional. Blake had left it there on purpose, testing her, seeing how much he could push before she broke completely. Every fight, every manipulation, every moment of gaslighting was carefully calculated to erode her confidence, to make her doubt her own instincts, to ensure that when the final blow came, she'd be too shattered to fight back. Valeria watched from the sidelines, feeding information to Blake, adjusting the plan as needed. They were methodical, patient, enjoying the game almost as much as the anticipated reward. "She's almost ready," Valeria said during one of their secret meetings at a hotel across town. Blake smiled, pulling her close, kissing her with a passion he'd never shown Lila. "Just a little longer. Once she's pregnant, we accelerate. By the time those babies are born, she'll be so broken she won't know which way is up." Valeria laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "I almost feel sorry for her." Blake shrugged. "Don't. She's a means to an end. Nothing more." And in her small apartment, Lila sat alone on the couch, one hand resting on her stomach, unaware that she was already pregnant with twins, unaware that the countdown to her destruction had already begun, unaware that the two people she trusted most in the world were actively plotting her complete annihilation. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom counter like a live grenade. 2 pink lines. Twins, the doctor would confirm 3 weeks later, her voice warm and congratulatory, while Lila sat frozen. In the examination room, unable to feel anything but dread. She should have been happy. She should have been celebrating. Instead, all she felt was the cold certainty that everything was about to get worse. Blake's reaction confirmed her fears. When she told him that evening, setting the ultrasound photos on the kitchen table between them, his face went carefully blank. Not surprised. Not excited. Just blank, like someone had flipped a switch and turned off every emotion. "Twins," Lila said, her voice trembling with hope she didn't really feel. "The doctor said they're healthy. Due in March." Blake picked up one of the photos, studying it without expression. "That's sooner than I expected. Not congratulations. Not I'm so happy. Just that sooner than I expected, like she'd told him the cable bill was due early." Lila's hands twisted in her lap. "Are you okay?" "You don't seem—" "I'm fine," he cut her off, standing abruptly. "This is just a lot to process. I need some air." He grabbed his coat and left, the door slamming behind him with a finality that made Lila flinch. She sat alone in the kitchen, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach, tears sliding down her cheeks. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't how any of it was supposed to be. Blake didn't come home that night, or the next. When he finally returned 2 days later, he offered no explanation, no apology. He simply walked past her into the bedroom, changed his clothes, and left again. The pattern repeated itself throughout the pregnancy. Blake became a ghost, present but absent, there but not there. He stopped touching her, stopped talking to her beyond what was absolutely necessary, stopped pretending to care. Lila tried everything. She cooked his favorite meals and watched them go cold on the table. She left notes, sent texts, called him at work only to be sent straight to voicemail. She dressed up, hoping to remind him of who they used to be, but he'd walk past her like she was furniture. "Blake, please talk to me," she begged one night, catching him in the hallway as he headed for the door again. "Tell me what I did wrong. Tell me how to fix this." He looked at her like she was something vaguely disgusting. "You want to fix this? Stop being so needy. Stop suffocating me. I can't breathe with you constantly demanding attention." "I'm not demanding attention," Lila said, her voice breaking. "I just want my husband back. I want the man I married." Blake laughed, cold and cruel. "That man never existed, Lila. He was what you needed him to be so you'd fall in love. Now you're pregnant and stuck, which was always the point. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? But he was already gone, the door slamming behind him, leaving her standing in the empty hallway wondering if she'd imagined what he'd just said or if he'd really admitted that their entire relationship had been a lie from the beginning. The pregnancy grew harder as winter deepened. Lila's body ached constantly, carrying twins taking a toll she hadn't anticipated. Her back screamed, her feet swelled, every movement exhausting. She continued teaching because she needed the money, Blake having drained their accounts to near nothing. But standing all day became torture. The school was freezing. The heating system broke more often than it worked, and Lila would come home shivering, her fingers numb, her body begging for rest she couldn't afford. Valeria continued to play her role, showing up periodically with gifts for the babies, acting concerned about Lila's deteriorating marriage. "He's just scared," Valeria said one afternoon, rubbing Lila's shoulders as they sat in the apartment. "Men get weird about fatherhood. Give him time." Lila wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe anything that made the nightmare make sense. But late at night, when she was alone and the babies kicked inside her, she'd lie awake knowing something was fundamentally broken, something that time wouldn't fix. Then, one evening in her 6th month, Lila found the letter. She'd been cleaning out a closet, preparing space for the nursery, when a box fell from the top shelf, spilling its contents across the floor. Most of it was junk, old papers, and forgotten documents, but one envelope caught her eye. It was addressed to her in handwriting she recognized immediately. Her mother's handwriting. Lila's hands shook as she opened it. The letter inside was dated 3 years ago, written shortly before her mother died. "My dearest Lila," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've met the conditions I set in my will. I'm sorry for the secrecy, but I needed to protect you from those who might try to take advantage of your kindness. You have inherited a fortune, my darling girl. Properties, investments, assets I spent my life building. But more importantly, you have inherited protection. I've arranged for someone to watch over you, someone who owes me a debt he can never repay. His name is Victor Hale. When the time comes, when you need him most, he will find you. Trust him. He knows everything. There are more letters hidden throughout the properties I've left you. Find them. They contain answers to questions you don't even know to ask yet. Be strong, my love. You are so much more powerful than you realize. Your mother, always." Lila read the letter 3 times, her mind racing. A fortune? Protection? Properties? None of it made sense. Her mother had lived modestly, working as a nurse, struggling to make ends meet. Where would she have gotten the kind of money the letter suggested? And who was Victor Hale? Before she could process any of it, she heard Blake's key in the lock. Panic seized her. Something told her not to let him see the letter, not to let him know what she'd found. She shoved it back in the envelope and hid it in her coat pocket just as he walked through the door. Blake looked at her suspiciously. "What are you doing?" "Just cleaning," Lila said, trying to sound casual. "Getting the nursery ready." He grunted, already losing interest, heading for the bedroom without another word. Lila waited until she heard the shower running, then pulled out the letter again, reading it one more time. Her mother had known. Somehow, she'd known Lila would need protection, would need resources, would need someone to intervene when things got bad. The question was, how bad did things have to get before Victor Hale appeared? That night, Lila lay awake, staring at the ceiling, one hand on her belly, where the twins moved restlessly. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. She felt a spark of curiosity, of possibility, of power she didn't understand yet but could sense waiting just out of reach. Her mother had left her something. Something Blake didn't know about. Something that might change everything. How much can a person endure before they break? And what happens when someone you think is broken suddenly discovers they're not powerless after all? The next few weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and planning. Lila continued her routine, teaching and pretending everything was normal. But underneath she was different. She watched Blake more carefully now, noting his patterns, his absences, his lies. She watched Valeria too, seeing things she'd missed before. The way Valeria's hand lingered on Blake's arm. The way they looked at each other when they thought Lila wasn't paying attention. The way Valeria always seemed to know things about Blake's schedule that Lila herself didn't know. They were sleeping together. The realization didn't hurt as much as she expected. Maybe because some part of her had known all along, had been screaming warnings she'd refused to hear. Or maybe because the letter had shifted something fundamental inside her, replacing heartbreak with strategy, replacing love with survival. She started documenting everything. Every time Blake disappeared, she noted the date and time. Every unexplained charge on their account, she photographed. Every conversation with Valeria where the woman's mask slipped just slightly, she remembered, filing it away for later. She didn't know what she was preparing for, but the letter had said there were answers, and Lila intended to find them. Then came the night Blake's phone rang while he was in the shower. Lila glanced at the screen. Valeria. Without thinking, she answered. Hello. Silence on the other end. Then Valeria's voice, tight with shock. Lila. Yes. Blake's in the shower. Can I take a message? Another pause, longer this time. Lila could almost hear Valeria's mind racing, calculating, deciding how to play this. No message, Valeria said finally, her voice carefully neutral. I'll call back later. She hung up. Lila stared at the phone, her heart pounding. Why would Valeria sound so shocked that Lila had answered Blake's phone? Why wouldn't she just leave a normal message, like any friend would? Unless they weren't just friends. Unless everything Lila suspected was true. Blake emerged from the bathroom, saw her holding his phone, and his expression darkened. What are you doing? Lila handed it to him, her voice steady. Valeria called. I told her you'd call back. He snatched the phone from her hand. Don't ever answer my phone again. Do you understand? Lila nodded, but inside something had crystallized. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She knew. And knowledge, her mother's letter had promised, was power. She just had to survive long enough to use it. The twins kicked hard, as if agreeing with her, as if telling her to hold on just a little longer. Somewhere across the city, Victor Hale sat in his car outside Lila's building, watching her window, waiting. He'd been waiting for months, following her mother's instructions, intervening only when absolutely necessary. He'd seen Blake's betrayal unfold. He'd watched Valeria manipulate and scheme. He'd documented everything, building a case that would destroy them both when the time came. But the time wasn't yet. Lila needed to break first. She needed to hit bottom before she could rise. That was how transformation worked. That was how queens were made. So Victor waited, patient and lethal, ready to step in the moment Lila needed him, ready to help her become everything her mother had prepared her to be. And in her apartment, surrounded by lies and betrayal, carrying two lives inside her own broken body, Lila Montgomery prepared for war without even knowing it. The contractions started 3 weeks early, ripping through Lila's body like lightning at 2 in the morning. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands, dialing Blake's number for the 4th time that night. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. Again. Blake, please, she gasped into the phone, pain stealing her breath. The babies are coming. I need you. Please come home. She hung up and dialed again. Nothing. The contractions were coming faster now, each one more brutal than the last. Lila tried to stand, tried to get to the door, but her legs buckled and she collapsed onto the floor, her vision blurring with pain and panic. She dialed 911, her voice barely coherent as she gave them her address. The paramedics found her 20 minutes later, curled on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood, barely conscious. We need to move now, one of them said, lifting her onto the stretcher. This is bad. The emergency room at St. Catherine's was chaotic, doctors and nurses moving with urgent precision as they rushed Lila into surgery. The twins were in distress, their heart rates dropping dangerously low. Emergency C-section was the only option. Do you have anyone we can call? A nurse asked, squeezing Lila's hand as they wheeled her toward the operating room. Lila tried to speak, tried to give them Blake's number, but the anesthesia was already pulling her under, darkness swallowing her whole. When she woke, the pain was different. Deeper, sharper, centered in her abdomen where they'd cut her open to save her babies. A nurse appeared beside her bed, smiling gently. You did it. 2 beautiful girls. They're in the NICU for observation, but they're fighters. Just like their mama. Lila's eyes filled with tears. Can I see them? Soon. Let's get you stable first. The nurse adjusted her checked her vitals, made notes on a chart. Is there someone you'd like us to call? The father. Lila nodded weakly. My husband. Blake Carrington. He should be. I'm here. Blake's voice cut through the room like ice. Lila turned her head, relief flooding through her despite everything. He'd come. He was here. But the relief died the moment she saw his face. He wasn't alone. Valeria stood beside him, and they weren't dressed like people who'd rushed to a hospital in the middle of the night. They were dressed for celebration. Blake wore a tailored suit, Valeria in a designer dress that probably cost more than Lila's entire wardrobe. They looked like they'd just come from somewhere expensive, somewhere important, somewhere that mattered more than Lila bleeding out while giving birth to his children. The nurse sensed the tension immediately, her smile faltering. I'll give you some privacy, she said quietly, backing toward the door. The moment she left, Blake's mask dropped completely. He walked to the foot of Lila's bed, not bothering to look at her face, his attention on his phone as he typed something quickly. We need to talk, he said, his tone businesslike, detached. Lila tried to sit up, pain shooting through her abdomen. Blake, where were you? I called you so many times. I was terrified. I was busy, he interrupted, finally looking at her. His eyes were cold, empty of anything resembling concern or love. Getting married, actually. The words didn't register at first. Lila stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to take it back. But Valeria stepped forward, holding up her left hand where a massive diamond ring caught the harsh hospital lights. Surprise, she said, her smile sharp as broken glass. We got married this morning. It was beautiful, actually. Small ceremony, just us and a judge. Very intimate. Lila's heart stopped. The machines beside her bed began beeping frantically, her blood pressure spiking, her body going into shock. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. You're lying, Lila whispered, her voice breaking. This is some sick joke. Blake, tell me this isn't real. Blake pocketed his phone, his expression bored. It's real. Valeria and I have been together for over a year. The marriage to you was temporary, a means to an end. Now that the twins are born, we don't need you anymore. The cruelty of it, the calculated brutality, hit Lila like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. The twins, she managed. You can't, they're your daughters. They're leverage, Blake said flatly. And speaking of which, you need to leave. Now. Lila laughed, the sound hollow and broken. I just had major surgery 3 hours ago. I can't even stand. Where exactly do you expect me to go? Valeria stepped closer, leaning against the bed rail, studying Lila like she was something mildly interesting under. A microscope. That's not really our problem, is it? You should have planned better. Maybe save some money instead of spending it all on. Oh, wait, you didn't spend it. We did. She laughed, the sound light and musical. Every penny you had is gone, Lila. We made sure of that. You're broke, homeless, and in about 10 minutes, you're going to be escorted out of this hospital with your babies because we're not paying for your care. Lila looked at Blake, searching his face for any trace of the man she'd married, the man who'd promised to love her forever. You can't do this. The babies need medical care. They're premature. They need, figure it out, Blake said, checking his watch. You have 5 minutes to get dressed and leave, or I'm calling security. He turned to leave, Valeria following close behind, but Lila's voice stopped them. Why? She asked, tears streaming down her face. Why would you do this? What did I ever do to you? Blake paused at the door, glancing back at her with something that might have been pity if he were capable of such an emotion. You were born with something we wanted. Your mother's inheritance. We needed you pregnant to unlock it. And now that you've served your purpose, we're done. Simple as that. Valeria smiled, adding her final blow. You really thought someone like Blake could love someone like you? God, Lila. You were always so pathetically desperate to believe in fairy tales. It made you so easy to manipulate. They left. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like the end of the world. Lila lay there, machines beeping around her, her body screaming in pain, her mind fracturing into pieces she didn't know how to put back together. How do you survive a moment like this? How do you keep breathing when everything you believed in has been revealed as a lie? She wanted to die. She wanted to close her eyes and let the pain take her, let the darkness swallow her whole. But somewhere down the hall, in the NICU, two tiny babies were fighting for their lives. Her daughters. The only thing in this world that mattered now. Lila forced herself to move. Every inch was agony, her stitches pulling, her body protesting violently. She grabbed the floor stand for support, using it like a crutch as she dragged herself out of bed. Blood soaked through the hospital gown, warm and terrifying. But she couldn't stop. She had to get to her babies before Blake did something worse. A nurse intercepted her in the hallway, an alarm flashing across her face. Mrs. Carrington, you can't get out of bed. You're hemorrhaging. I need to see my babies, Lila said, her voice raw. Please. I need to see them. The nurse looked torn between protocol and compassion. Compassion won. She wrapped an arm around Lila's waist, supporting her weight as they made their way to the NICU. Through the glass, Lila could see them. Two tiny, perfect girls, hooked up to monitors and machines, their little chests rising and falling with effort. They were so small, so fragile, so utterly dependent on her. They're beautiful, the nurse whispered. Strong, too. They're going to make it. Lila pressed her hand against the glass, sobbing, racking her body. I don't know how to protect them. I have nothing. I am nothing. The nurse squeezed her shoulder. You're their mother. That's everything. But it wasn't. Not in a world where fathers abandoned their children and husbands destroyed their wives for money. Not in a world where love was a weapon and trust was a trap. Lila stood there, bleeding and broken, watching her daughters fight for every breath, and made a decision. She would survive this. She would find a way. Because those two tiny girls deserved a mother who didn't give up, who didn't break, who fought even when fighting seemed impossible. She didn't know about Victor Hale yet, watching from the hospital parking lot, waiting for his moment. She didn't know about her mother's fortune, about the protections and resources waiting to be activated. She didn't know that Blake and Valeria had made a fatal miscalculation, that their greed had blinded them to the trap they'd walked into. All she knew was that she had to survive the next 5 minutes, then the next hour, then the next day. One breath at a time. One step at a time. One impossible moment after another. And somewhere in the depths of her shattered heart, a spark ignited. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Rage. Pure, crystalline rage at what had been done to her, at what they tried to take, at the life they tried to destroy. Blake Carrington had no idea what he'd just unleashed. But he was about to find out. The blizzard had turned New York into a frozen wasteland. Snow piling 3 feet high in places, wind cutting through clothing like razors. Lila stumbled through it carrying 2 newborns against her chest, each step a battle against pain, exhaustion, and the realization that she had nowhere to go. Victor Hale's car had been warm, safe, a brief respite from the nightmare. He'd driven her to a women's shelter on the Lower East Side, a building that looked like it had survived a war and lost. This is the best I can do right now, Victor had said, his voice apologetic as he helped her out of the car. Your mother's instructions were specific. I can't reveal everything until the legal conditions are met. But I can keep you alive until then. That's what matters. Lila had been too exhausted to question him, too broken to care about mysteries and inheritances. She just needed somewhere warm for her babies, somewhere they could survive the night. Victor had walked her inside, spoken quietly to the woman at the desk, handed over cash that got Lila a bed without the usual paperwork. I'll be watching, he'd said before leaving. You're not alone, even when it feels like you are. Then he was gone, and Lila was left standing in a hallway that smelled like bleach and desperation, holding 2 infants who were crying from hunger she had no way to satisfy. The shelter was called Haven House, though there was nothing Haven-like about it. The room Lila was assigned was barely 8 by 10 feet, containing 2 bunk beds, a small dresser, and a window so grimy you couldn't see through it. She shared it with 3 other women, all of whom stared at her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion when she entered. "You just gave birth," one of them said, not a question but a statement. She was older, maybe 50, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd worked hard for decades. "Hours ago," Lila whispered, lowering herself carefully onto the bottom bunk. Every movement sent shockwaves of pain through her abdomen, her stitches pulling, threatening to tear. "I'm Maria. That's Kesha. And that's Brianna." Maria gestured to the other 2 women. Kesha was young, maybe 20, with a baby of her own sleeping in a makeshift crib beside her bed. Brianna looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate office, her clothes expensive despite being wrinkled, her manicured nails chipped but still visible. "What's your story?" Kesha asked, not unkindly. Everyone in a place like this had a story. Lila's throat tightened. "My husband threw me out. Right after I gave birth. He married someone else." The words sounded insane even as she said them, like something from a soap opera rather than real life. Maria's expression hardened. "Men are garbage. All of them. You're better off without him." Brianna laughed bitterly. "Amen to that. My husband cleaned out our accounts and disappeared with his secretary. Left me with nothing. Not even my dignity." Kesha nodded. "My boyfriend beat me unconscious when I told him I was pregnant. I woke up in the hospital and never went back." The room fell silent, each woman processing their shared trauma, the sisterhood of survival that bound them together in this place. "We look out for each other here," Maria said finally. "That's the only way we make it. You need something, you ask. Understand?" Lila nodded, tears streaming down her face. She'd never expected kindness from strangers, never expected to find humanity in a place designed for people society had forgotten. But here it was, raw and real, and the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. The first week was pure survival. Lila's body was failing, the C-section healing poorly, infection setting in despite the antibiotics a shelter nurse provided. She developed a fever that left her shaking and delirious, unable to care for the twins properly. Maria and Kesha stepped in without being asked, taking turns feeding the babies with donated formula, changing diapers with supplies they'd somehow scrounged from the shelter's limited resources, holding them when they cried while Lila lay in bed barely conscious. "You have to fight," Maria whispered one night, pressing a cool cloth to Lila's burning forehead. "Those babies need you. You don't get to give up." Lila wanted to argue that she had nothing left to fight with, that every part of her was broken beyond repair. But Maria's eyes held a fierceness that wouldn't accept defeat, a determination born from her own survival. So Lila fought. She forced herself to eat when food made her nauseous. She walked the hallways when every step felt impossible, rebuilding strength she'd lost. She held her daughters even when her arms shook with exhaustion, whispering promises she had no idea how to keep. By the second week, the fever broke. Lila's body began healing slowly and painfully, but healing nonetheless. The twins grew stronger too, their cries becoming more demanding, their eyes beginning to focus and track movement. Lila named them in the middle of one sleepless night, staring at their perfect faces in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. "Emma," she whispered to the older twin, the one who'd been born first, fighting hardest. "And Grace," she said to the smaller one, who watched the world with solemn, knowing eyes. Emma and Grace, her daughters, her reason for surviving. The shelter had rules that felt designed to crush whatever spirit residents had left. Everyone had to be out by 8 in the morning, regardless of weather or circumstances. You could return at 6 in the evening, but only if you'd attended a job training session or proven you were actively looking for work. Lila couldn't work. She could barely walk. But the rules didn't care about circumstances, So every morning she'd bundle the twins against her chest, wrap herself in whatever layers she could find, and stumble out into the freezing city. The subway became her sanctuary, the only place that was warm and didn't cost money to exist in. She'd ride for hours, switching trains randomly, moving through the underground maze of tunnels and platforms while other passengers avoided looking at her. She was invisible again, just another homeless woman with babies that people would rather pretend didn't exist. But invisibility had advantages. Nobody questioned where she was going or why. Nobody reported her for sleeping on subway benches when exhaustion made it impossible to keep moving. Nobody cared, which meant nobody interfered. During those long, desperate days underground, Lila noticed things. The way businessmen checked their phones obsessively, their faces tight with stress despite their expensive suits. The way women clutched their purses like lifelines, trusting nothing and no one. The way everyone moved through life in their own isolated bubble, terrified of connecting, terrified of being vulnerable. She'd been like that once, alone and scared, desperate for someone to see her. That's what had made her so easy for Blake to manipulate. Have you ever been so desperate for love that you ignored every warning sign? Have you ever wanted to believe in something so badly that you let yourself be destroyed? One afternoon in her third week at the shelter, while riding the F train toward Brooklyn, Lila saw him. Blake. He stood on the platform at Lexington Avenue, wearing a cashmere coat and talking on his phone, laughing at something the person on the other end said. He looked happy, successful, untouched by the devastation he'd caused. Valeria was with him, hanging on his arm, her designer bag probably worth more than everything Lila owned in the world. They looked like a perfect couple, young and wealthy and exactly the kind of people New York celebrated. Lila pressed herself into the corner of the subway car, praying he wouldn't look up, praying he wouldn't see her. But he did. Their eyes met through the dirty window for one brief, terrible moment. Blake's expression didn't change. He didn't look surprised or guilty or concerned. He looked right through her, like she was nothing, like she'd never existed at all. Then the train moved and he was gone. Lila couldn't breathe. The walls of the subway car closed in, her vision tunneling, panic seizing her chest in a grip so tight she thought her ribs would crack. The twins started crying, sensing her distress, and Lila forced herself to focus on them, forcing herself to breathe through the terror. He'd looked at her like she was already dead, like he'd killed her and moved on, and she was just a ghost haunting his periphery. Maybe she was. Maybe the woman who'd loved Blake Carrington, who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings, had died in that hospital room. Maybe the woman sitting on this subway with 2 infants and a future that looked like nothing but darkness was someone else entirely. Someone harder. Someone who could survive anything because she'd already survived the worst. Back at Haven House that evening, Maria pulled Lila aside. "There's something you should know. A man's been asking about you." Lila's blood turned cold. What man? Didn't give a name. But he left this. Maria handed her an envelope, thick and official looking. Lila opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a key and a note written in precise, unfamiliar handwriting. "Your mother prepared for this. The countdown begins the day your children are born. 30 days. Trust the process. Trust me, Victor." Lila stared at the note, her mind racing. 30 days until what? What countdown? What process? The key felt heavy in her palm, important somehow, but meaningless without knowing what it unlocked. "Who is he?" Maria asked. "I don't know," Lila admitted. "But my mother trusted him. That has to mean something." Kesha, who'd been listening from her bunk, leaned forward. "Be careful, Lila. Men who show up with mysterious keys and cryptic notes usually want something. And you can't afford to be fooled again." She was right. Lila knew she was right. But the note had mentioned her mother, who had confirmed that something was waiting, something that might change everything. She just had to survive 30 days. 30 days of cold and hunger and fear. 30 days of watching her daughters grow in a shelter that barely provided enough to keep them alive. 30 days of being invisible while Blake and Valeria lived their perfect life, believing they'd won. Could she make it? Could she hold on that long? She looked down at Emma and Grace, sleeping peacefully in their donated bassinet, unaware of the war being waged around them. For them, she could endure anything. For them, she would become whoever she needed to be. The falling world had tried to crush her, and had stripped away everything she thought she was. But maybe that was necessary. Maybe you had to lose everything before you could become the kind of person who could take it all back. Lila folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket along with the key. 23 days left. The countdown had begun. Day 23 felt like drowning in slow motion. Lila sat on a subway bench at 2 in the morning, Emma and Grace sleeping against her chest, while snow fell outside the station entrance in thick, silent sheets. She'd started marking the days in a small notebook Maria had given her, crossing off each one like a prisoner, counting down to freedom she couldn't yet comprehend. The key Victor had left burned in her pocket, a constant reminder that somewhere beyond this nightmare, something waited. But 23 days felt like an eternity when you were living minute to minute, heartbeat to heartbeat, survival measured in whether your babies ate that day or not. A woman approached from the other end of the platform, her heels clicking against concrete, an expensive coat buttoned against the cold. She looked at Lila with that particular expression wealthy people wore when confronted with poverty, something between pity and disgust. Then she dug in her purse and held out a $20 bill. For the babies, she said, not quite meeting Lila's eyes. Lila wanted to refuse, wanted to say she wasn't begging and wasn't asking for handouts. But Emma needed more formula, and Grace had a rash that required cream Lila couldn't afford. So she took the money, whispered thank you, and hated herself for needing charity from strangers, while her husband lived in luxury built on her mother's stolen fortune. How does it feel to be reduced to nothing? To know the man who destroyed you is celebrating while you're grateful for $20 from a stranger who can't even look at you? Day 20 brought an envelope slipped under her pillow at the shelter. Lila found it that evening when she returned from another endless day riding trains and hiding from the cold. Inside was a newspaper clipping and another note from Victor. The clipping showed Blake and Valeria at some charity gala, dressed like royalty, smiling for cameras, the caption identifying Blake as a rising philanthropist and Valeria as his devoted wife. The image made Lila's stomach turn. But Victor's note was more interesting. He's leveraging your mother's assets. Properties she left you are being mortgaged under forged documents. Valeria's family law firm is facilitating the fraud. They think they're untouchable. They're wrong. 17 days left. Lila read it 3 times, her mind struggling to process the implications. Her mother had left her properties, multiple properties, and Blake was somehow accessing them, stealing from an inheritance he didn't even know she knew about. Maria noticed her distress. Bad news. Lila handed her the clipping. Maria studied it, her expression darkening. That's your husband? Was my husband. I guess technically still is until the divorce is finalized, if it ever is. Maria tossed the clipping back. He looks like every other rich bastard who thinks the world exists to serve him. They all have that same smile, like they're posing for their own statue. Brianna leaned over from her bunk. I know that law firm. Danton and Associates. They handled my divorce. Took my husband's side, destroyed my credibility, made sure I walked away with nothing. If they're involved, you're dealing with serious corruption. Lila's hands shook. What am I supposed to do? I don't have a lawyer. I don't have money. I don't even have proof I'm married to him anymore since he apparently married someone else while still married to me. Kesha spoke up from where she was feeding her own baby. You wait. This Victor guy said 17 days, right? Maybe that means something. Maybe whatever your mom set up activates then, and you get what you need to fight back. It was thin hope, barely substantial enough to cling to. But it was all Lila had. Day 15 brought Victor himself. Lila was sitting in a coffee shop near the shelter, one of the few places that let her stay for hours nursing a single cup while the twins slept. She looked up from the newspaper she'd been pretending to read and found him sliding into the sea across from her. "You look terrible," he said, without preamble. Lila laughed bitterly. "That's what happens when you live in a shelter and ride subways for 12 hours a day." Victor pulled out a folder, setting it on the table between them. "Your mother anticipated this. Every step of what's happening to you, she saw coming. Not the specifics maybe, but the pattern. She knew someone would try to take advantage of you, exploit your kindness, steal what she'd built." Lila stared at the folder like it might bite her. "What's in there?" "Documentation. Your mother's will, sealed until today. Property deeds. Financial statements. Evidence of Blake's fraud. Everything you need to understand what's about to happen." Victor pushed it toward her. "But you can't open it yet. Not for another 15 days. That's when the legal conditions are fully met and the inheritance becomes irrevocable." Lila wanted to rip it open immediately, wanted answers to the questions that had been torturing her for weeks. "Why? Why make me wait?" "Because your mother's lawyer structured it this way for your protection. If you'd had access to this money immediately after the twins were born, Blake could have challenged it, claimed it was marital property, and dragged you through courts for years. But if you wait the full 30 days, the inheritance activates under conditions that make it legally untouchable. It becomes yours and yours alone, completely protected from any claims he might make." Victor's expression softened slightly. "I know it's torture. I know every day feels impossible. But 15 more days ensures Blake can never take it from you. Can you hold on that long?" Lila looked down at her daughters, at Emma, who was starting to smile, and Grace, who watched everything with those solemn, knowing eyes. "I don't have a choice." Victor nodded. "Good. Because on day 30, everything changes. You'll have resources, legal protection, power Blake doesn't know exists. And we're going to use all of it to destroy him." He stood to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Stop riding the subways. Blake's people have been looking for you. They know you're in the shelter system, and they're trying to track you down. Stay inside as much as possible. Don't give them opportunities to find you before you're ready." Fear spiked through Lila. "What do they want?" "To intimidate you. Possibly to get you to sign away rights to the twins or to any potential inheritance. They're getting nervous because they've discovered some irregularities in the documents they forged. They're starting to realize your mother protected her assets better than they anticipated." Victor's smile was cold and sharp. "They're beginning to understand they made a mistake. They just don't know how big they are yet." He left, disappearing into the afternoon crowd, leaving Lila with a folder she couldn't open and 15 days that felt like 15 years. Back at Haven House that evening, Lila broke the rules and stayed in her bunk during the day. Maria covered for her, telling the staff Lila was sick, which wasn't entirely a lie. The infection from her C-section had flared up again, leaving her feverish and weak. But she couldn't risk going out, couldn't risk Blake finding her before the countdown ended. Day 10 brought a visitor Lila didn't expect. A woman in a business suit appeared at the shelter, asking for Lila Montgomery by name. Maria intercepted her at the front desk. "Who's asking?" The woman handed her a card. "Celeste Wu. I work for Danton and Associates. I need to speak with Ms. Montgomery about a legal matter." Maria's expression hardened. "She's not here." But Lila had heard the commotion and emerged from the back hallway, curiosity overriding caution. "I'm Lila Montgomery." Celeste turned, studying her with sharp, calculating eyes. "We need to talk. Privately." They sat in a small room the shelter used for counseling sessions. Celeste closed the door and sat across from Lila, her professional mask slipping to reveal something unexpected. Concern. "I'm going to be very direct," Celeste said. "I work for Valeria's family firm. I helped process the documents for your husband's marriage to her. I've also been watching them commit fraud for the past 3 weeks, using forged signatures to access properties and assets that don't belong to them." Lila's heart raced. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired of helping rich people destroy innocent ones. I've been documenting everything, building a case against them. But I need you to survive long enough for it to matter. How much time do you have left?" Lila calculated quickly. 10 days until the inheritance activates. Celeste nodded. Then we need to keep you hidden for 10 more days. Blake's getting desperate. He knows something's wrong, but he can't figure out what. Valeria thinks they can force you to sign everything over if they find you, threaten to take the twins away, use the courts to destroy you before you have resources to fight back. She pulled out her phone, showing Lila photos she'd taken secretly. Blake and Valeria in their lawyer's office, surrounded by documents. Blake screams at someone on the phone, his face red with rage. Valeria crying, mascara running, her perfect facade cracked. They're falling apart, Celeste said. The fraud is catching up to them. Bank accounts are being frozen. Property sales are being blocked. They don't understand why yet, but your mother built safeguards they can't bypass. Every move they make gets documented, every crime recorded. Lila stared at the photos, something fierce and hot burning in her chest. Not quite satisfying, but close. Why risk this? If they find out you're helping me, they'll destroy me. I know, but I'm done being part of the machine that grinds people like you into dust while people like them get richer. Consider this my rebellion. Celeste stood. 10 days. Stay hidden. Stay alive. And when that countdown hits 0, we unleash hell. Day 5 arrived with spring's first hint, temperatures rising slightly, snow melting into gray slush. Lila felt different, stronger somehow despite the exhaustion. Emma and Grace were thriving, growing each day, their little personalities emerging. Emma was bold, loud when she wanted attention. Grace was quieter, watching everything, processing the world in her own time. Lila had started planning, using the long hours in the shelter to think through what she'd do when the inheritance activated. She made lists, strategies, priorities. First, secure housing. Second, ensure the twins' medical care. Third, destroy the people who tried to destroy her. Maria found her scribbling in her notebook one evening. What's all this? Plans, Lila said. For after. Maria sat beside her. You really think this inheritance thing is real? You're not being set up. It was a fair question. Lila had asked herself the same thing repeatedly. I think my mother loved me enough to protect me. And I think Victor is following her instructions because he owes her something he can never repay. So yes, I think it's real. I think in 5 days, everything will change. Maria squeezed her hand. Good. Because you deserve it. You and those babies deserve everything good that's coming. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, holding the key Victor had given her, wondering what it unlocked, what waited on the other side of day 30. Blake thought he'd won. Valeria thought she destroyed her. They'd celebrated their victory, lived their beautiful life, believed Lila was nothing, nobody, already forgotten. But in 5 days, the woman they'd thrown away would rise. And when she did, they'd realize they hadn't destroyed her. They'd created something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. A woman who'd survived hell and come out the other side forged in fire. A queen they never saw coming. Blake Carrington stood on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, champagne in hand, watching the city glitter beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered. 3 weeks had passed since he'd thrown Lila out of that hospital, and life had never been better. The apartment was worth $8 million, purchased with money from properties he'd quietly liquidated using documents Valeria's firm had expertly forged. His closet held suits that cost more than most people made in a month. His calendar was full of meetings with investors eager to throw money at the self-made entrepreneur the media had started celebrating. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd worked toward for 2 years, had come together perfectly. Valeria emerged from the bedroom wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than Lila's entire wardrobe had been worth. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. What are you thinking about? Blake smiled, taking another sip of champagne. How easy it was. She really believed I loved her. God, she was pathetic. Valeria laughed, the sound sharp and satisfied. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remember she was sitting on a fortune and too stupid to even know it existed. Blake turned to face her, pulling her close. Your firm did excellent work with those documents. No one's questioning anything. Not yet. My father's partners handled it personally. The signatures are perfect. The notarizations, all legitimate looking. As far as the city records show, Lila signed over her rights to everything voluntarily. Valeria's smile widened. By the time anyone figures out something's wrong, we'll have sold everything and moved the money offshore. She'll have nothing and no way to prove we took it. Blake's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression shifting slightly. Another block transaction. That's the third one this week. Valeria waved dismissively. Probably just bureaucratic nonsense. You know how slow the city is with property transfers. But something nagged at Blake, a small voice in his head whispering that things were going too smoothly, and then suddenly weren't. 3 block transactions in 1 week wasn't normal. And the bank had called yesterday asking questions about account origins, wanting documentation he didn't have. I'm sure it's nothing, he said, pushing the concern away. He'd worked too hard, planned too carefully for something to go wrong now. Everything was fine. Everything was perfect. Downstairs in the building's lobby, a man in a maintenance uniform adjusted his cap and made notes on a clipboard. Victor Hale had been watching Blake's building for weeks, documenting every movement, every visitor, every moment of the false victory Blake was celebrating. He'd photographed Blake and Valeria together, recorded their conversations through long-range equipment, and tracked every dollar they'd stolen. The evidence was mounting into something devastating, something that would destroy them both when the time came. But not yet. Victor checked his watch. For more days until the inheritance is activated. For more days of letting Blake believe he'd won while the trap closed around him invisibly, inevitably. That evening, Blake and Valeria hosted a dinner party for 12 of their wealthiest acquaintances. The apartment gleamed, every surface polished, every detail perfect. Caterers moved efficiently through the space, serving food that cost more per plate than most families spent on groceries in a week. To success, Blake announced, raising his glass as guests gathered in the living room. And to my beautiful wife, who makes everything possible. Everyone drank, everyone smiled, everyone played their role in the performance of wealth and happiness. But across the table, Richard Chun, one of Blake's biggest investors, studied him with narrowed eyes. I heard you were married before. Recently divorced. Blake's smile didn't waver. A brief mistake. We weren't compatible. And the children? Richard pressed. I heard there were twins. Valeria jumped in smoothly. Being handled through the courts. These things take time, but Blake's lawyers are managing everything. Richard nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He made a mental note to have his people look into Blake's background more thoroughly. Men who lied about marriages usually lied about other things too, and Richard hadn't become wealthy by trusting people who set off his instincts. After the guests left, Blake found himself unable to sleep. He stood in his study looking at paperwork spread across his desk, documents that should have been simple, but somehow kept getting complicated. Another property sale had fallen through that morning. Another bank account had been flagged for review. Another lawyer had called asking questions Blake didn't have good answers for. What's wrong? Valeria asked from the doorway. She'd changed into pajamas, her makeup removed, looking younger and somehow more predatory without the polished facade. I don't know, Blake admitted. Something feels off. Like we're missing something important. Valeria crossed the room, reading over his shoulder. It's probably just Lila making trouble. She probably hired some cheap lawyer to contest things. Blake shook his head. Lila doesn't have money for lawyers. She doesn't have money for anything. I made sure of that. Then what are you worried about? Blake wanted to explain the feeling in his gut, the sensation that he was standing on ground that looked solid but was actually hollow, ready to collapse beneath him. But he couldn't articulate it, couldn't make it make sense. Nothing, he said finally. You're right. It's probably nothing. 3 days before the inheritance activated, everything started unraveling faster. Blake's main investor pulled out, citing concerns about asset origins. 2 property sales that had been pending for weeks suddenly got blocked by the city. Legal holds placed on titles for reasons no one would explain. His bank called demanding he come in for a meeting about irregularities in his accounts. Valeria was panicking now, her cool facade cracking. This isn't normal, Blake. Something's happening. Someone's targeting us. They sat in their lawyer's office, Valeria's father's firm, surrounded by men in expensive suits who looked increasingly uncomfortable. The signatures on these documents, one of them said carefully, they're being challenged. Someone's claiming they're forged. Blake's blood ran cold. That's impossible. We were careful. Everything was perfect. The lawyer exchanged glances with his colleagues. Mr. Carrington, we need to ask you directly. Did Lila Montgomery actually sign these documents transferring her property rights to you? Blake's mind raced. He couldn't admit to forgery, couldn't implicate Valeria's family's firm. But he also couldn't explain how he'd gotten signatures from a woman who'd been unconscious in a hospital recovering from surgery. She signed them, he lied. I was there. She signed everything voluntarily. The lawyer didn't look convinced. Then we'll need her to testify to that effect. Where is she currently? Blake realized with sudden horror that he had no idea. He'd thrown her out of the hospital a month ago and hadn't thought about her since. For all he knew, she was dead, frozen in some alley with those twins. The thought should have bothered him, but mostly he was just angry that she was causing problems, even in her probable absence. I'll find her, he said. Give me a few days. Finding Lila proved harder than Blake expected. She'd disappeared into the city like a ghost, no credit card transactions, no phone records, no trail. He hired a private investigator who reported that she'd been spotted at a women's shelter, but had since vanished. Blake's panic increased. If she was in the shelter system, she might have access to legal aid, might be building a case against him. Or worse, she might have already died and her death would complicate everything legally, tie up the assets for years while courts sorted through the mess. We need to find her, he told Valeria on day 28, his voice tight with stress. We need to get her to sign something confirming she gave us those properties voluntarily, something that will hold up if this goes to court. Valeria was pacing their bedroom, her perfectly manicured nails bitten raw. What if she won't sign? What if she knows what we did? Blake grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Then we make her sign. We threaten to take the twins. We destroy her credibility. We do whatever it takes. But even as he said it, Blake felt the ground shifting beneath him, felt the careful construction of his perfect life beginning to crack. How do you destroy someone who has nothing left to lose? How do you threaten someone who's already survived the worst thing you could do to them? On day 29, Blake finally located Lila. The private investigator called with an address, a women's shelter on the Lower East Side. Blake drove there immediately, Valeria beside him, both of them determined to end this problem before it destroyed everything they built. But when they arrived, the director of the shelter met them at the door with crossed arms and an expression that suggested she'd dealt with men like Blake before. Lila Montgomery checked out this morning, she said. I don't know where she went. Blake wanted to scream. She's my wife. I have a right to know where she is. The director's smile was cold. Actually, you don't. And if you don't leave this property immediately, I'm calling the police. They left, Blake's hands shaking with rage. Tomorrow was day 30, the date when something significant was supposed to happen according to the cryptic warnings his lawyers had been giving him. He didn't understand what it meant, didn't understand why that date mattered. All he knew was that Lila had disappeared and his perfect life was falling apart. That night, Blake couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Valeria, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something massive moving toward him, something he couldn't see, but could sense like an approaching storm. Across the city, in a hotel room Blake would never find, Lila sat with Emma and Grace sleeping beside her, Victor's folder finally open on her lap. She'd waited 30 days, survived 30 days of cold and hunger and fear. And now, as midnight approached and day 30 began, she read her mother's words and understood for the first time exactly how powerful she'd become. The villains had celebrated their victory. They'd lived their beautiful lives. They'd believed they were untouchable. Tomorrow, they'll learn the truth. Tomorrow, The queen they'd created would rise. And when she did, she'd take everything. Day 30 began with sunrise breaking through the hotel window, light spilling across papers Lila had been reading for hours. Her mother's letters, detailed and deliberate, laid out everything. 15 properties across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions. A trust fund designed specifically to activate after childbirth, protected by legal structures so complex that Blake's forgeries had been meaningless from the start. Every document he'd signed, every property he'd tried to liquidate, had been caught by safeguards her mother had built years before Lila even met him. "Your mother was brilliant," Victor said, sitting across from her with coffee he'd brought from downstairs. "She knew someone would try this eventually. She built a fortress around you and disguised it so well that predators like Blake wouldn't see it until they'd already incriminated themselves completely." Lila looked up from the papers, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "She knew I'd be vulnerable. She knew I'd fall for someone like him." Victor's expression softened. "She knew you had a good heart. And she knew this world punishes people with good hearts unless they're protected. So she protected you the only way she could, by making you powerful enough that no one could destroy you." Emma stirred in the bassinet beside Lila, making small noises that meant she'd wake soon wanting food. Grace slept on, peaceful and undisturbed. Lila reached out, touching Grace's tiny hand, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility pressing down on her. "What happens now?" Victor pulled out another folder, this one thick with photographs and documents. "Now we go to war. But strategically, carefully, with every move planned. Blake thinks he's being investigated for fraud. He doesn't know the extent of what we have. He doesn't know about Celeste feeding us information from inside Valeria's firm. He doesn't know that every conversation he's had in his apartment for the past month has been recorded." He spread photos across the table. Blake and Valeria arguing, their perfect facade cracked. Blake on the phone screaming at his lawyers. Valeria crying in their bedroom, mascara running, realizing something had gone terribly wrong. "They're falling apart," Victor continued. "The pressure's breaking them. But we need to time the final blow perfectly. If we move too soon, they lawyer up and disappear into legal protections. If we wait too long, they might flee the country." Lila studied the photos, feeling something cold and powerful settle in her chest. Not quite hatred, but close. A crystalline determination to make them pay for every moment of suffering they caused. "When?" Victor smiled, and it was not a kind smile. 3 days. "We let them panic, let them make mistakes, let them incriminate themselves further. Then we strike when they're most vulnerable." Lila nodded slowly. She'd waited 30 days. She could wait 3 more. That afternoon, Lila met with her mother's lawyers at a firm in Midtown, a place so elegant it made her feel like an imposter in her thrift store clothes. But the senior partner, Margaretchen, greeted her like royalty. "Ms. Montgomery, I've been waiting for this day. Your mother was one of my dearest friends. She made me promise to protect you, and I intend to honor that promise." They sat in a conference room overlooking the city, Margaret's associates spreading documents across a massive table. "Your inheritance is now fully activated," Margaret explained. "All properties, investments, and trusts are under your complete control. Blake Carrington's attempts to access them have been documented as fraud. We have enough evidence to put him in prison for 15 years. Lila's hands shook as she signed document after document, each one transferring enormous wealth into her name. What about the twins? He could try to claim custody. Margaret's expression hardened. He abandoned them hours after birth, threw you out of a hospital while you were recovering from major surgery, and married another woman while still legally married to you. Any judge who sees that evidence will terminate his parental rights immediately. You have nothing to fear from him legally." But Lila knew fear wasn't always rational. Blake had controlled her for so long, manipulated her so completely, that part of her still expected him to win somehow, to find a way to take everything again. "I want him destroyed," Lila said quietly. "Not just legally. I want everyone to know what he did. I want his reputation burned to the ground." Margaret smiled. Then let's make that happen. The transformation happened in stages. First, housing. Margaret took Lila to a penthouse her mother had owned in Tribeca, a space so beautiful it made Lila cry. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, rooms full of light and possibility, a nursery already prepared as if her mother had known Lila would need it someday. "It's yours," Margaret said. "Always has been. Your mother bought it 20 years ago, kept it maintained, waiting for you." Lila walked through the space, holding Emma, Grace in Victor's arms, as he followed quietly. Every room felt like a gift, like her mother reaching through death to give her daughter the life she deserved. That night, Lila slept in a real bed for the first time in over a month, the twins and bassinets beside her. Security Victor had hired patrolling the building. She should have felt safe, should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt hollow, scraped clean by trauma that wouldn't heal just because she had money now. Maria called that evening, her voice warm through the phone. "Heard you came into some good fortune. Is that true?" Lila smiled despite the exhaustion. "It's true. My mother left me things I didn't know existed." "Good. You deserve it. But don't forget us when you're living that fancy life. Okay? The women here, we're still fighting the same battles you just won." Lila promised she wouldn't forget, and she meant it. The shelter sisterhood had saved her life when she had nothing. That debt could never be repaid, but it could be honored. Day 32 brought the first public move. Margaret's firm released a statement to major media outlets detailing Blake Carrington's fraud, his bigamous marriage, and his abandonment of newborn children. The story exploded across news sites and social media, Blake's carefully constructed image evaporating in hours. Lila watched from her penthouse as her phone filled with notifications, reporters requesting interviews, people she hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reaching out with sympathy and curiosity. But she stayed silent, letting the facts speak for themselves, letting Blake drown in the consequences of his actions. Blake's response was predictable. He called a press conference denying everything, claiming Lila was mentally unstable, that he tried to help her but she'd refused. Valeria stood beside him, playing the supportive wife, both of them performing for cameras while their world collapsed behind the scenes. But then Celeste dropped the bomb. She released recordings to the media, conversations between Blake and Valeria planning the con, laughing about how easy Lila had been to manipulate, celebrating her destruction. The audio was damning, undeniable, and brutal. Within hours, Blake's investors abandoned him. His board demanded his resignation. Properties were seized. Bank accounts frozen. The perfect life he'd built crumbled in real time, broadcast across every screen in the city. Valeria's firm fired her, her father disowning her publicly to save his own reputation. She'd helped orchestrate fraud that implicated the entire company, and they cut her loose without hesitation. Day 33 brought Blake to Lila's door. Victor tried to intercept him at the building entrance, but Blake pushed past, desperate and wild-eyed, taking the elevator to her penthouse and pounding on the door until she opened it. "You did this," he spat, his perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. "You destroyed everything." Lila stood in the doorway, holding Emma, Grace visible in the bassinet behind her, and looked at the man who'd tried to break her. He looked smaller now, diminished by consequences he'd never imagined facing. "No," she said calmly. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped letting you destroy me too." Blake's expression shifted between rage and desperation. "I can fix this. We can fix this. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding, that you gave me permission. I gave you nothing. You took everything. And now you're paying for it." Lila stepped back, beginning to close the door, but Blake lunged forward, grabbing her arm. "You can't do this. Those babies are mine. I have rights." Victor appeared from the stairwell, moving faster than Blake expected, pinning him against the wall with efficiency that suggested military training. "You have no rights. You abandoned them. You threw their mother into a blizzard hours after birth. You married someone else while still married to her. You stole from her inheritance. You have nothing, and you are nothing." Victor's voice was cold, final. "Security is on the way." If you ever come near this building again, I'll have you arrested for harassment and attempted assault." Blake struggled, then went limp, the fight draining out of him. "This isn't over, Lila. I'll fight you in court." You'll lose," Lila interrupted. "You'll lose because I have resources you can't imagine, lawyers you can't afford, and evidence you can't refute. You're done, Blake. Accept it." Security arrived, dragging Blake to the elevator while he screamed threats that sounded increasingly empty. Lila closed the door, her hands shaking, adrenaline flooding through her system. "You okay?" Victor asked. Lila nodded, though tears streamed down her face. "I'm better than okay. I'm free." The next morning, Margaret called with news. Valeria's trying to negotiate. She wants immunity in exchange for testifying against Blake. Lila considered it. Part of her wanted them both destroyed equally, both punished to the full extent possible. But another part, the strategic part her mother's letters had awakened, understood that Valeria's testimony would guarantee Blake's conviction, and would ensure he never had a chance to rebuild. "What does she have to offer?" Lila asked. Margaret's smile was audible through the phone. "Everything. Recordings, documents, details about other frauds Blake committed before he met you. She's willing to burn him completely to save herself." Lila thought about the woman who'd pretended to be her friend, who'd helped orchestrate her destruction, who'd smiled while planning her downfall. Could she let that go unpunished? "Immunity from criminal charges," Lila said finally. "But I want her sued civilly for every penny she took. I want her reputation destroyed. I want her to spend the rest of her life working to pay back what she stole. And I want a public apology recorded and released to every outlet that covered this story." Margaret laughed. "Done. I'll have the terms drafted within the hour." That evening, Lila stood at her window watching the city lights, Emma and Grace sleeping peacefully behind her. 33 days ago, she'd been dying in the snow with no hope and no future. Now she stood in a penthouse she owned, surrounded by resources that would ensure her daughters never suffered the way she had, preparing to watch the man who'd tried to destroy her face justice she'd orchestrated. How does it feel to go from powerless to powerful in 30 days? How does it feel to watch your enemies crumble while you rise? Lila smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It felt like victory. Cold, sweet, absolute victory. Day 35 arrived with the kind of clarity that follows storms. The sky washed clean and impossibly blue. Lila stood in front of her mirror, Emma sleeping in her arms, Grace being fed by the nanny she'd hired the day before. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd stumbled through snow a month ago. Same face, same scars, but something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer the victim of someone else's cruelty. Today, she would face Blake in court, and today, his world would end completely. Margaret arrived at 9, carrying a briefcase that contained everything they needed. "Are you ready for this?" Lila kissed Emma's forehead, handed her to the nanny, and turned to face her lawyer with eyes that had seen hell and come back harder. "I've been ready since the moment he threw me out." The courthouse was downtown, a massive building that had witnessed countless battles between right and wrong. Lila walked through the entrance flanked by Victor and Margaret, photographers shouting questions she ignored, reporters pushing microphones she walked past without acknowledgement. She'd given no interviews, made no public statements. Today, the facts would speak for themselves. Blake was already inside the courtroom, sitting with his lawyers at a table that looked increasingly empty as his legal team dwindled. 3 lawyers had quit in the past week, unwilling to defend a case they knew was indefensible. Valeria sat in the gallery behind him, no longer his wife in any way that mattered. Her immunity deal signed, her testimony prepared, her role reduced to witness against the man she'd helped destroy Lila. When Blake saw Lila enter, something flickered across his face. Not quite fear, but close. Recognition, maybe. That the woman walking toward him in an elegant suit that probably cost more than he had left in his frozen accounts was not the broken victim he'd created. She was something else entirely. The judge entered, A woman in her 60s with silver hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every lie men like Blake had ever told. This is a hearing to determine custody of the minor children Emma and Grace Montgomery, and to address criminal charges of fraud, bigamy, and financial exploitation. Mr. Carrington, you're representing yourself. Blake stood awkwardly. His last lawyer had quit yesterday. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked at him with something between pity and contempt. That's generally a poor decision, but it's your right. Ms. Montgomery, I see you're represented by Chun and Associates. Very well. Let's begin. Margaret stood, and what followed was not a trial, but an execution. She presented evidence in methodical waves, each one more damaging than the last. First, the hospital records showed Lila had given birth via emergency C-section at 6 p.m., and Blake had entered her room at 9 p.m. to announce his marriage to another woman and demand she leave immediately. The judge's expression tightened. Mr. Carrington, you threw a woman out of a hospital 3 hours after major surgery? Blake stammered. It wasn't like that. She was fine. The doctors said she was hemorrhaging and should remain hospitalized for at least 3 days, Margaret interrupted, presenting the medical reports. She was sent home against medical advice because you refused to pay for her continued care despite having access to significant financial resources at the time. Next came the marriage certificate showing Blake had married Valeria while still legally married to Lila. The ceremony performed by a judge who'd since been investigated for performing fraudulent marriages. Bigamy, Margaret stated flatly. He married another woman without divorcing his legal wife, making his second marriage void and opening him to criminal prosecution. Blake tried to argue. I thought the divorce was finalized. There was confusion about there was no divorce filing. The judge interrupted, looking at her documents. You never filed for divorce, Mr. Carrington. You simply married another woman and hoped no one would notice. Then Margaret presented the financial evidence, and this was where Blake's face went pale. Documents showing he'd used forged signatures to access properties belonging to Lila's mother's estate, liquidating assets worth millions, transferring money to accounts in his and Valeria's names. These signatures, Margaret said, displaying them on screens throughout the courtroom, were allegedly signed by Ms. Montgomery on dates when she was either unconscious in the hospital or living in a homeless shelter barely able to walk. Forensic analysis confirms they're forgeries, expertly done, but forgeries nonetheless. Blake's remaining composure cracked. I didn't forge anything. Valeria's firm handled. Valeria's firm is under investigation by the State Bar. Margaret continued. 3 partners have been arrested. They've provided testimony implicating you as a knowing participant in the fraud. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Carrington, do you understand the severity of these charges? We're talking about fraud, forgery, theft, and exploitation of a vulnerable person. These are felonies that carry significant prison time. Blake looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. She's lying. This is all lies. She wanted revenge because I left her, so she made all this up, then explained the recordings, Margaret said, and pressed play. The courtroom filled with Blake's voice, clear and unmistakable, talking to Valeria in his apartment. The moment those twins are born, the inheritance activates. We wait until she's too broken to fight back, then we take everything. She'll never see it coming. Valeria's laughter followed. She's so pathetically trusting. This is almost too easy. More recordings played. Blake talking about forging documents. Valeria discusses which properties to liquidate first. Both of them celebrated Lila's destruction like it was a game they'd won. The judge's expression had moved past contempt into something colder. Mr. Carrington, I've been on the bench for 23 years. I've seen a lot of cruelty. But throwing a woman who just gave birth to your children into a blizzard with nowhere to go while you celebrate with your mistress? That's a level of inhumanity I rarely encounter. Blake tried one last desperate play. Those children are mine. I have a right to see them, to be their father. You abandoned them hours after birth. The judge cut him off, her voice sharp. You left them homeless. You provided no support, no care, no acknowledgement of their existence. You have no rights here, Mr. Carrington. You surrendered those rights the moment you threw them into the street." She looked down at her paperwork, then back up at Blake. Custody of Emma and Grace Montgomery is awarded solely and permanently to their mother. Your parental rights are terminated effective immediately. You are barred from any contact with these children unless they, as adults, choose to seek you out. Additionally, I'm referring these criminal charges to the district attorney with a recommendation for prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. Blake collapsed into his chair, his face ashen. Everything he'd built, everything he'd stolen, everything he believed he could get away with had just evaporated. Margaret wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we're also filing civil suits for emotional distress, theft, fraud, and punitive damages. We're seeking full restitution of all stolen assets, plus $20 million in additional damages." The judge nodded. "Granted. Mr. Carrington, you'll be surrendering any remaining assets to Ms. Montgomery immediately. Bailiff, take him into custody pending criminal charges." As guards moved forward, Blake finally looked at Lila. Really looked at her. And in that moment, he understood what he'd done. He hadn't just destroyed a marriage or stolen money. He'd created an enemy far more powerful than he'd ever imagined. And she'd waited patiently for this exact moment to watch him fall. "Lila, please," he whispered as they pulled him to his feet. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Lila stood, walked to the barrier separating them, and looked him in the eyes. "You're not sorry you did it. You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference." She turned to leave, then paused. "You taught me something important, Blake. You taught me that people will take everything from you if you let them. But you also taught me that survival isn't about being strong from the beginning. It's about refusing to stay broken. So thank you for making me into someone who could destroy you." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Lila had one statement prepared. She stepped to the microphone Margaret had arranged, Victor beside her, and spoke to the cameras. "My name is Lila Montgomery. 5 weeks ago, my husband threw me and my newborn daughters out of a hospital with nowhere to go. He stole everything I had, married another woman while still married to me, and believed I'd disappear quietly. He was wrong. To every woman watching this who's been betrayed, abandoned, or told she's worthless, hear me. You are not what they say you are. You are not powerless. You are not broken beyond repair. Survive. Fight. Rise. And when you do, make them regret ever underestimating you." She stepped away from the microphone and walked to the car where her daughters waited. That evening, back in the penthouse, Lila sat with Emma and Grace, both babies sleeping peacefully, unaware that their mother had just won a war they'd never have to fight. Maria called to congratulate her. Kesha sent flowers. Brianna texted that she'd watched the whole thing on the news and cried. The shelter sisterhood had witnessed one of their own rise, and it gave them hope that maybe they could too. Victor appeared in the doorway. "You did it." Lila smiled, tired but satisfied. "We did it. You, Margaret, Celeste, my mother's planning. All of it." Victor nodded. "What's next?" Lila looked down at her daughters, at their perfect faces and their peaceful sleep, and thought about the question. What came after survival? What came after justice? "Now," she said softly, "we live. We build a life where these girls never have to be afraid, never have to beg, never have to accept cruelty as the price of love. We create something beautiful from the ashes of what he tried to destroy." She looked up at Victor. "And we help other women do the same." 6 months later, Lila opened a foundation in her mother's name, providing legal aid, housing, and resources to women escaping domestic violence and financial abuse. The shelter where she'd survived became its first partner, fully funded, expanded, transformed into a place where women didn't just survive, but prepared to rise. Blake served 4 years in prison, his reputation destroyed, his fortune gone, his life reduced to the consequences of his choices. Valeria rebuilt slowly, working to repay her debts, her own fall from grace complete. And Lila? She became exactly what her mother had prepared her to be. Not just wealthy, not just powerful, but purposeful. A woman who'd walk through fire and emerge not burned but refined. A queen who remembered what it felt like to have nothing and used everything she had to make sure other women didn't have to suffer alone. Justice doesn't always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes 30 days of freezing in the snow, of surviving on scraps, of holding onto hope when hope seems like a lie. But when it arrives, when the truth finally comes to light and the powerful fall, it's worth every moment of suffering. Because the woman who survives becomes unstoppable. And the men who tried to destroy her learned the hardest lesson of all. Some women don't just survive. They rise. And when they do, empires fall. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most. Remain blessed.